In a world defined by boundaries, some stories cannot be contained by borders. This is Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. Today, we descend into the bloodiest battle in the history of human warfare, a 6-month inferno of urban combat, frozen starvation, and impossible courage that shattered the myth of German invincibility and turned the tide of the Second World War forever. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. To understand why Stalingrad became hell on earth, you have to understand what drove Adolf Hitler's obsession. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga, the longest river in Europe, controlling the flow of oil from the Caucasus region to the Soviet heartland. Without that oil, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. But this was more than strategy. The city carried the name of Joseph Stalin himself. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad meant humiliating his greatest ideological enemy. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, a massive offensive aimed at the Caucasus oil fields. The German 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was ordered to secure the flank by capturing Stalingrad. It was supposed to be a secondary objective, a footnote. Instead, it became the most consequential battle of the 20th century. August 23, 1942. The sky over Stalingrad turned black. Over 600 Luftwaffe bombers, Henkels, Junkers, and the screaming Stuka dive bombers descended on a city of 400,000 civilians. In a single afternoon, the Luftwaffe flew over 1,000 sorties. High explosive bombs shattered apartment blocks into rubble. Incendiary bombs turned the Volga oil storage tanks into towering pillars of flame, visible for 50 miles. The firestorm was so intense that the river itself appeared to burn. By nightfall, over 40,000 civilians were dead. Stalingrad, a modern industrial city of wide boulevards, apartment blocks, factories, and parks, had been reduced to a moonscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The Germans believed this devastation guaranteed a swift conquest. They were catastrophically wrong. The rubble they had created became the Soviet defenders' greatest weapon. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. When General Vasily Zhukov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army, he understood one brutal truth. The open steppes favored German tanks and air power, but inside the ruins, those advantages evaporated. Zhukov ordered his men to hug the enemy, to fight at such close range that German artillery and aircraft couldn't fire without hitting their own troops. The battle fragmented into a nightmare of intimate violence. Combat raged not across front lines, but through individual buildings, individual floors, individual rooms. Soldiers fought with rifles, grenades, bayonets, sharpened shovels, and bare hands. A single building might change hands dozens of times in a day. At night, Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under constant bombardment, ferried on barges through burning oil slicks to replace the fallen. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours, and still they held. In the heart of the devastation stood a single 4-story apartment building on January 9th Square. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of just 25 soldiers seized the building and turned it into an impenetrable fortress. They fortified the windows with sandbags, laid mines in every approach, positioned machine guns and anti-tank rifles with overlapping fields of fire, and tunneled through basement walls to connect supply routes. For 58 days, Pavlov's garrison held that building against wave after wave of German assault. Tanks, infantry, flamethrowers. The Germans threw more men at this single apartment building than they had used to capture the entire city of Paris. On Soviet military maps, the building was marked as a fortress. Every single defender survived. Among the ruins, a different kind of war was being fought. Invisible, patient, lethal. Soviet snipers turned Stalingrad into the most dangerous place on earth for German officers. The most famous among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Ural Mountains whose preternatural accuracy became legendary. In a single 10-day stretch, Zaitsev killed 40 German soldiers. His total confirmed kills during the battle would exceed 200. Soviet propaganda amplified Zaitsev into a folk hero. According to accounts, disputed by some historians but deeply embedded in the mythology of Stalingrad, the Germans dispatched their finest marksman, Major Erwin Koenig, head of the Wehrmacht sniper school, to hunt Zaitsev down. For days, the two snipers stalked each other through the frozen rubble, each knowing that a single mistake, a single glint of light on a rifle scope, meant death. Whether Koenig truly existed or not, the sniper war was devastatingly real. In those ruins, patience was the deadliest weapon of all. While the world watched the slaughter inside the city, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov was planning the most audacious counteroffensive of the war. For months, Stalin and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had been secretly massing over 1 million fresh troops, 1,500 tanks, and 13,000 artillery pieces on the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. These flanks were held not by elite German units, but by weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions stretched thin across the frozen steppe. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus struck. Under cover of blizzard and fog, waves of Soviet armor smashed through the Romanian 3rd and 4th armies like a sledgehammer through glass. Within 4 days, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, snapping shut a ring of steel around the entire German 6th Army. 330,000 Axis soldiers, the largest and most experienced army in the Wehrmacht, were trapped inside a pocket the Germans called Der Kessel, the cauldron. Inside the Kessel, 300,000 men began to die. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler he could supply the trapped army by air. He needed to deliver 300 tons of supplies per day. On the best day, the Luftwaffe managed 65. Most days it was far less. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries and fighter planes turned the air corridor into a graveyard of transport aircraft. The temperature plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find: curtains, tablecloths, the coats of dead comrades. Rations were cut, then cut again. Men ate horses, then rats, then boiled leather. Frostbite blackened their fingers and toes. Typhus ravaged the ranks. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a desperate relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, but it stalled 60 kilometers short of the pocket. Paulus radioed Hitler, begging permission to attempt a breakout. Hitler's response was absolute. The 6th Army will hold its position to the last man and the last round. Stalingrad was now a tomb. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets offered Paulus formal surrender terms: food, medical care, and repatriation after the war. Hitler forbade acceptance. Instead, he promoted Paulus to field marshal, a pointed, cruel gesture since no German field marshal had ever surrendered in the history of the nation. It made no difference. On January 31st, in a frozen basement beneath a demolished department store, Paulus surrendered. He became the first German field marshal ever captured alive. Of the 330,000 soldiers originally trapped in the Kessel, 91,000 survived to become prisoners of war. They were marched into Soviet captivity, skeletal, frostbitten, many barely able to stand. The death marches and the brutal conditions of the Soviet prison camps claimed the vast majority of those who remained. Of those 91,000, only approximately 6,000 ever returned home to Germany. The last of them did not come home until 1955, a full decade after the war had ended. The Battle of Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility forever. From February 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union, and it would not relinquish it until Berlin itself fell in flames. Stalingrad consumed nearly 2 million human lives, soldiers and civilians, German and Soviet, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that after the war, Soviet engineers debated whether to rebuild it at all. They did. Today it is called Volgograd, but the world remembers its older name, and the lesson it carved into history in blood and ice, that no army, no ideology, and no dictator's obsession is stronger than the will of those who refuse to surrender their home. This has been Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. The guns have fallen silent, but the stories never will.